All right, hello everybody. Today I've got a short one for you, or at least I hope it's going to be short. But I just had a really cool little, I don't know, what would you call it, like a epiphany or you know, pretty significant change. I've been editing my first novel, and I'm working on the sixth draft at this point. And it's one of those things where people often kind of get into a very narrow view. They get tunnel vision when they're doing redrafting sometimes. And they're like, well, I just want to change this little bit or this little bit. But one thing that you should always be aware of, even if, as I've mentioned in an earlier video, you're making, my draft 4 is just me trying to trim out excess stuff. Or, you should, if you can, focus on a particular aspect of your writing, whatever that writing is, essay, story, whatever. It helps to have a redrafting process be focused on some particular goal. But at the same time, listen to the back of your head as you're working on stuff, because sometimes you'll discover that, for instance, a chapter that you thought was about as good as the rest is now not quite as good as the rest, right? You've been making improvements to previous chapters, and you're really happy with them at this point, or you're getting happier with them. And then as you read this next chapter that you're going through and editing, you find that there's something about this that I'm not quite feeling, like I'm not getting the, ooh, this is kind of cool sense out of this. And that happened with me yesterday when I was editing chapter 18, which is called, well, I've titled that chapter tentatively Gray Market Deal. We'll see how that changes, or if it changes afterwards. But I was reading it and I was like, there's something clunky about this. And what I discovered was that I made a couple of mistakes that had persisted through 5 drafts. And I discovered a fairly minor set of changes that I could make to the thing to actually make it flow a lot better. So I'm not going to read the whole things to you because I feel like that would just be overselling it. But like, what I'll do is I'll talk about how things were in version 5 and how things are now in version 6. So in the old version 5, at the start of this chapter, we started with a pretty significant time skip, and we started it with a tirade by a new character, someone who has just been introduced in the book. And it seemed like it was way too much of a jump for the start of a chapter, especially because it was like, well, this happened at the end of chapter 17. Basically, they discovered that this space station that they thought a bunch of pickers were at has been abandoned, and so they're like looking for clues as to the whereabouts of the crew of the Heliotrope in that chapter. And there's a thing where they start to hear something through the walls of the space station, and they're like, well, that's odd. And then they lose contact with Wyatt's ships. Wyatt is the security company owner and commander who they're working with in this job. And they discover that someone basically dropped in nearby, and Wyatt's 2 ships managed to subdue them before they could get away, and that's why they were out of communication. And it's not explicitly stated, but that's why they were out of communication, but it's suggested. One of the things I've learned is that you should always try to, not always, but it's often helpful to add just a little tiny bit after the conclusion of a puzzle, right, to make sure that the reader is on board with that. Because in chapter 17, people aren't quite sure, or the reader won't quite be sure why they lost communication. It could be something really bad happened. It could be something, it could just be something, like a system failure. But in chapter 18, we learn, or at the very end of chapter 17, we learn kind of why they were out of communication. But in this chapter, one thing that I added was just a little half sentence, like 3 or 4 words that just kind of, now that this puzzle is closed, it's like, this is what it was, so that if anybody got left behind, then they can catch up there. So that was a little thing that I added. But the other thing is that in version 5, we started with this time skip and this tirade by a new character. Instead, what I was like, what I should do is I should push that back a little bit, and we should start not with this tirade by this new character, but with a planning session between Eric, the main character, and Wyatt, the security officer. And so what I did is I took a disjointed jump to a random character that you have never met before, saying a bunch of stuff without really justification, to established characters. Number one, having some interactions to show how they get along with each other. Number two, having them explain between each other what they're planning on doing with this guy, Nicholas Maggs, who they caught, basically trying to access this pirate station, effectively. And so I feel like that reduces the time jump, because instead of just them appearing in this conference room and having this guy yelling at them for messing up his ship, they're like, okay, we got this. Do you know what's going on? Here's what I'm going to do when we get in there. We're going to interrogate this guy a little bit, in a reasonable way, but we're also going to make sure we have this position and this position and this position. And so instead of starting with something new and out of nowhere, we're starting with two established characters, and we're having them kind of say, okay, here's how we think this is going to go. After that, they get in. There's an element of this interaction that that in version 5, I basically just had the main character, Eric, kind of blah at it to the reader without too much like justification. And so I moved that as well around so that now he's doing it in response to a question. Because from a flow perspective, it makes more sense for a character to answer another character than for a character to suddenly blah at the reader about an element of the story. And so instead of having Eric just basically say, oh, this is what a code phrase is, blah, 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 what we have is during that planning session, Wyatt says, you know what a code phrase is, right? And then Eric is like, oh, yeah, it's this. And so they have a little... instead of just having an exposition dump in 2 paragraphs, I now have a little bit of back and forth in there as well, so that the 2 characters are actually discussing this topic and why it's so important. I feel like that's a significant improvement over the previous version. I mentioned that there was this time jump going into this chapter, and this never really made 100% clear why they lost communication with Wyatt's ships in the previous chapter. I added like 3 or 4 words at the end of a sentence somewhere to just say, oh, by the way, it was this. And that way, every reader, whether they were thinking about this or not, manages to catch up. The other thing about doing this is that Eric and Wyatt are both main characters. They're probably going to be, Eric is a recurring character because he's the main character in all these stories. He's even the POV character. And then Wyatt is, one of the characters that is going to be recurring as these stories go on, assuming they go on, right? And so what I did is I added a little bit more interaction between them to show their friendship, basically. In the previous version, I had Wyatt basically bluff at Nicholas Maggs, this captain of this ship that they're trying to get information out of. And it wasn't telegraphed in any way. And you don't want to telegraph a bluff to the person that you're bluffing at. But the thing is that this is all dependent on everybody who's working on the interrogation, keeping a mutual front, keeping a straight face. And so the fact that Wyatt pulls this bluff out of nowhere might cause Eric to be like, just something as simple as his eyebrows raising, right, could be enough to tip off Nicholas Maggs that Wyatt is bluffing. And so instead, we have Wyatt kind of subtly telegraph that, hey, I'm going to try something like this when we get in there, so be ready for it, and keep an eye on him. And so now Eric is primed to expect a bluff and to react appropriately when it happens, basically by making sure that he keeps an eye on his own face, or rather keeps attention on his own facial expressions, and keeps his attention focused on Maggs rather than darting it over to the side like, what do you mean, right? So I think that's a significant improvement too. And then the final thing that I really changed that I think makes the thing a little bit more consistent is they managed to convince Maggs to help them out. They're like, look, we're dealing with a guy who's killed at least 38 people. And he has not yet been brought to justice. He has not yet paid for his transgressions, and it's because of him that we disturbed these pickers who were mostly living as relatively peaceful scavengers. It's this guy who made who made this bloodthirsty mission happen, right? And so Mags is like, fine, all right, I'm with you as long as we can deal with this. And then I had him, for some reason in the previous version, I had him kind of go back on that a little bit, where Wyatt asks him a question about if he knows where the previous station that the pickers were using was, right? And number one, Mags should have expected that question. And so it was strange that in version 5 he was like taken aback by it. But number two, he already agreed to help, and if he can help at all, this is kind of like the most basic way he can help, is giving information as to where we can pick up the trail, right? And so instead of having him kind of like try to lie and kind of backpedal out of it a little bit, I just kind of simplified that part of this chapter a little bit. So he's like, yeah, I do have that information, how are we going to work with this kind of thing? And I think that improves Mags's character a little bit as well, making him seem a little bit less stupid. Because one of the elements of this chapter, nevertheless, is that he is kind of a bad liar, right? So he tries to kind of weasel out of Wyatt's accusations in a few ways, but he's not very good at it. And that's an element of the chapter that I wanted to keep in. But having him kind of like say, all right, I'm with you, and then 5 seconds later be like, oh, I don't know about that, is, I think, not an intelligent decision on his part. And so I think that this tightens up his character a little bit more, makes him seem a little bit more competent, maybe not a competent liar, but more competent in understanding what he's gotten himself into, right? And so I think that's actually a big improvement on his character, and he's a bit character. He appears in this chapter and the next chapter, and that's it. But I think making him a little bit more consistent and a little bit more intelligent is a big improvement in this chapter. When I was reading it to edit it yesterday, I was like, I thought this was a good chapter before, but I've improved the previous chapters a lot, and this one is just not jumping out at me. And now version 6 is actually pretty significant improvement. So I don't know. I think the lesson to learn from this is that always be open to the possibility that you will discover something that is a significant change, but is also a significant improvement, even in late versions of the drafts. I think that version 6 or version 7 is probably going to be approximately where I cut this loose and release this novel. I might do one more quick little overlook for like typos and stuff like that, but I think I've handled most of those. But I was a little surprised to find such a significant change in going from version 5 to version 6. But at the same time, I kept my mind open to the possibility that there was such a change to be made. And I kept listening to that little voice in the back of my head that was like, this chapter's not as good as the previous one you just read, kind of thing. So, I think this advice applies to redrafting in general, whether you're doing nonfiction or fiction. Basically, if your brain is telling you that something is not quite right with a particular portion of your writing, whether it be a section of an essay or or a chapter in a story or something like that, that even in version 5 you might discover like a brainwave where you're like, oh, I can make this better by doing this, and also be open to making those more significant changes even in the later drafts. Basically, I added maybe 250 words to this chapter by adding the little planning session before they got in and started doing the interrogation. I'm going to have to double check that extra well for typos and stuff before I move on to the next section or the next draft version. But it was a significant edit where I had to take big blocks of text from here and move them up here, and take this one and move it down here. But at the same time, that kind of effort is not the kind of thing that you should be complacent about when you're redrafting. If you discover that there's a significant improvement that you can make to a story or to an essay or to any piece of writing or any piece of artistic, artistic expression, or even just intellectual expression, to even broaden that, right? You come up with a new bridge to a song that you're writing or something like that. Be open to those kinds of changes, even though they're a little bit more work. You'll be more satisfied with the result in the end rather than producing something that you're like, oh, I should have fixed that afterwards. And it makes I think it can make a fairly sizable difference in, not just your appreciation of the work, but other people's appreciation of the work as well. Because if I had refused to go along with that impulse in the back of my head, I would end up, hypothetically, with a story where there's a bunch of good chapters, and then this one lackluster chapter, and then a couple more good chapters to close out the book. And I think readers would have noticed that. They would have said, "Oh man, I liked it up to here," and then right here it kind of takes a dip off a jump off a cliff, and you got this stupid guy who's doing stupid things, and then you've got this time jump and whatever. So yeah, I think that's the takeaway for today, is that if you're writing something, whether it be an essay, a persuasive essay, or any type of intellectual expression, redrafting is important, which we've gotten through that before, but keeping an eye out for that hunch in the back of your head that's like, this isn't as good as the last chapter or section or whatever, or there's something wrong with this right here. Even though it's a little bit more work, that kind of thing can happen even in your sixth draft. And so, just be open to it, be aware of it, as opposed to saying, it's good enough. Because, if you can make it better, then why not make it better? But I think that's all I've got for today. Still working on the Ultima 8 video. That one's going to end up being a little bit more top level, because that's just one of those games that I have not completed yet, and I don't have time to run through it unless I were to heavily use a walkthrough and kind of critique the writing in depth. But hopefully I'll still be able to provide you guys with some interesting opinions and some interesting observations about that game, because I did play it a little bit just to kind of jog my memory, and I think that there's some really interesting points about not just the writing but also the design of that game in general that are worth looking at and understanding. So I'm working on that. I'll probably have a short video later this week about the most recent episode of the Wordy Pair podcast, because I think the most recent one that we released is actually quite good. And I like them all, but this one is especially good. So I think I want to talk about that and the book that we were talking about a little bit, called Massacre of Mankind by Stephen Baxter. It's a official sequel to H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds. But yeah, that's what I've got going on this week. I hope that this little discussion on redrafting and the potential for significant improvements, even in the 5th or 6th or 7th draft of something, is something that you find valuable, because everybody has to write something here and there, even if it's something short, right? It means the editing cycles can go faster and faster if you're writing something short. But if you find yourself on draft 7 of something, you're like, oh wait, I need to make this big change. It's probably worth listening to that gut instinct, because you can always revert back to the previous version, assuming you've got some kind of version control going on. At bare minimum, here's version 5, here's version 6. They're 2 separate files. You can do more than that, but we won't get into that technical digression at this point. Anyway, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. As always, if you like what I'm doing, if you like these kinds of videos and you want to support the channel, you know what to do. And I will see you next time, maybe tomorrow, maybe Thursday, maybe Friday, with pardon me, with either the Ultima 8 video or talking about the podcast episode. So yeah, have a good one, and I'll see you later.